Hi, and welcome to NARC Troopers, Narcissistic Abuse Recovery Collaborators. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Anthony Mazzella from New York. He is a seasoned psychoanalyst and psychotherapist with a private practice specializing in individuals, couples, and families. He also is a faculty member and supervisor at at institutions of higher learning, and he's also a mentor for the next generation of psychodynamic mental health professionals. In addition to all of this and his clinical work, Dr. Mazzella is a sought-after keynote speaker at conferences and seminars nationwide, driven by a passion for continuous learning through podcast and video channel that he has called the Narcissism Decoder. And I'll post the link below so that y'all can check that out. He shares valuable insights and strategies and practical tips for navigating narcissistic and borderline personality disorder. Welcome, Dr. Mazzella.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that very generous introduction as well. And I'm really excited to be here to talk to you today about what I think is going to be a pretty complicated topic. So thanks again.
Well, thank you for your time, your gift of time.
Hmm.
Let me begin by saying that, there's just so much information out there, so many podcasts, so many articles, people writing on Substack and Medium and different platforms, and there's just an avalanche of material. And sometimes it's really difficult, I think, to find the people who are putting out verifiable content that is factual, fact-based, and not just designed to get you to buy their program and do their
Yes.
workbook or something. And so I appreciate you and the other people who are determined to keep going. I've been doing this for 5.5 years, and some of the people that were online 5.5 years ago are no longer there.
Mm.
And a few of them are, and I really appreciate their persistence in getting the word out there because there's just so much misinformation and disinformation about narcissistic personality disorder and these types of disorders and what happens to people after being in relationships with them in the aftermath.
Hmm.
So I think that's what we're looking at today a little bit. When they discard you, which is ultimately the final cycle piece in their cycle of abuse, if they don't get to that, then maybe perhaps you escape earlier before the discard happens. But either way, you find yourself trying to put the pieces back together and discover that this is not your regular breakup. This does not follow any of the norms or expectations of what recovery from a broken relationship looks like. There's all kinds of things that happen to you. And I would like to help people understand that a little bit more, especially, a lot of people who listen to our podcast and who read our articles are in recovery, but maybe they could send this to their neurotypical friends who have never had a relationship with anyone like this to educate them that they are not just being dramatic and need to get over it, that there are tangible, palpable reasons why they cannot and why recovery is prolonged and very, very difficult and on a whole another level from what regular grief and recovery would be. So, however you would like to tackle this topic, why is it that people cannot seem to get up off the ground after a relationship with a narcissist? Why can they not just go through the regular stages of grief and get on with it,
Mm.
quickly?
Well, this is a wonderful question. And if I may, I'd like to sort of set a little foundation first so that we could sort of move into that, which is what I've recognized a lot more today is because there's more information out there regarding narcissism, is that more people are recognizing that they're in a relationship with somebody who may have these kinds of narcissistic characteristics and something doesn't feel quite right to them, but they cannot extract themselves from the relationship. So I
Mhm.
feel like if it's okay with you, Jen, what I like to do is set that foundation of, first of all, thinking about why is it so difficult to leave, like to extract oneself? And then to your point, what happens once you get out that makes it almost impossible to move forward with one's life? So if you don't
Mhm.
mind, can I jump in there in terms of what does the relationship even look like, if we could call it that?
Absolutely. Yes,
Okay,
let's
good.
take it apart.
Okay, great. So one reason I'm really excited to be here talking to you in particular is because you were saying a moment ago that there's a lot of disinformation out there on narcissism. And part of the disinformation, in my mind, has to do what I would consider splitting. In other words, when someone's in this kind of relationship and they recognize that their partner may be narcissistic, they begin to blame, right? And accuse. And then they feel very victimized by this person. And it's not that this does not occur, but it's not always the full story. And what I mean by that is you have to think when one is in a narcissistic relationship, where does that type of relationship primarily exist? It exists mainly in what we call fantasy. Now, what's fantasy? The fantasy typically, it could go in a couple different ways, but it's the immediate gratification that they're going to get in the moment of being in this relationship. In other words, there's something compelling and so exciting about being with this person that it binds them to them. Even though they, again, like I said, something may not be quite right. There are a
Mhm.
lot of emotional ups and downs, but there's something there, the immediate gratification, which is really important because as you and I continue to talk, we may end up comparing this to what some people do, like an addiction. And with any addiction, you get an immediate gratification. The second piece is the hopes and the dreams that you attach to the relationship. Now, you think you're attaching it to this person as an individual person, like it's about them. But again, this is the fantasy of the relationship. So it's not just that you're in a relationship, but I've heard you use this concept before, and it really resonated with me quite deeply. In your earlier episodes, you've called it the shared fantasy. And I think you even had an interview with somebody who said, this is the shared fantasy. And I was like, yes, this makes complete sense. Because if we go back in terms of my own bias, I'm a psychoanalyst by training. So I've studied this psychoanalytic for many, many years. We've called this different things. Like it's known as developmentally, there's a symbiotic stage of development. That's a natural stage that all infants and children move through. That's also known as maternal preoccupation, where the mother early on in life, or the caregiver, we can say, is completely preoccupied with the developing child. It's also been referred to coincidentally as the narcissistic phase of development. So it's no wonder people struggle with this today. So in this, and there's one other concept for it, which is the grandiose self merged with the omnipotent other. And basically, I'll just break that down very quickly. What that means is the grandiose self, that's the immediate gratification that I mentioned just a moment ago, where you have a wish or a need of some sort, and it feels like there's always somebody there who's going to see you or recognize you. And that is so gratifying. So, and of course, that's the merger with the omnipotent other, because in your mind there's a real strong conviction that this person, when you're in that moment with them, that shared fantasy, right, when you're in it, that they are completely perfect and capable of gratifying and meeting all your needs.
Mhm.
So this sort of lays a bit of a foundation. And if we want to break it down, I mean, I could keep going, Jen, but if we want to break that down or you have any thoughts about it, I would welcome them.
Well, let me interject this.
Yes.
When these healthy developmental stages are interrupted in childhood, and the mother or that caregiver figure is unavailable, incapacitated, inaccessible, Dr. Sam Vaknin calls it the dead mother,
Yes.
that she's or she or he is unable to provide those things, to actually see the child.
Yes.
That doesn't happen. They don't see them. Then there's an interruption in healthy development.
Yes.
And the other thing I would want to say, what you said about it's a narcissistic phase. I think that we need to understand that narcissism is on a spectrum, and that
Mm-hmm.
there's a healthy amount,
Yes.
and then there's a very malignant pathological amount, kind of like
Yes.
if you were to have a glass of wine with dinner. That's one thing on the spectrum, but when you're having the whole bottle every night, maybe a second one too, that's another
Yes.
thing. It's no
Yeah.
longer the glass of wine that's healthy, it becomes the bottle that is going to kill you.
Yes.
And
So,
so it's the
yeah,
same
this is
with
great.
narcissism.
No, this is great. And I love this interchange. So let me just play off of a few things you said. So yes, you're absolutely correct. I didn't want to go too far into the weeds, but there's something actually that's called primary and secondary narcissism. So the
Hmm.
primary narcissism is that healthy level of development. That's the maternal preoccupation. That's this early symbiotic phase that's so important for the later stages of development to go accordingly, because that's where you develop a secure, you've heard of this, secure attachment, safety, trust in the world, trust in other people. Then you could venture out and not be in a narcissistic, what we also call a psychic retreat, because people get into this psychic retreat, this grandiosity, that is the grandiose sense of self. That's the structure, by the way, that holds the narcissist together.
Hmm.
So, yeah, so primary, perfectly normal, secondary narcissism, that's like 3 glasses of wine at night, if we could compare it. And the dead mother thing that you mentioned has stirred up a lot for me immediately once you said it. So Christopher Bolus actually was the one who came up with this concept of the dead mother. And basically what that means is a mother who is almost affectlessness. I
Hmm.
didn't say that correct, but there's not a lot of affect.
Affect.
And this stuff is not just theory. This has been shown through research, and any of your listeners can do a quick search on this. It's called the still face experiment. And this is they filmed mothers and fathers playing with as early as like 12 to 18-month olds, right? This is how early this stuff starts in development. And they showed them playing, the babies cooing and smiling and pointing and laughing, and all they had the parent do was put on a still face, kind of like the dead mother that you just
Mhm.
mentioned. And within seconds, I think it took 90 seconds, the baby starts to slowly decompensate to the point where they're looking away, gaze aversion, right?
Mhm.
Look, and then they're basically, it's almost heartbreaking to watch it. So I just warn any of your listeners who decide to check it out. It's on YouTube, by the way. But anyway, so I digress, but it was an important digression because it speaks to how important the gaze is in these relationships and
Yes,
really feeling like you're being seen and recognized.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And, I think that they manifest parts of that in their own persona as they develop as with this disorder, in the fact that they have flat affect, they have flat attachment styles. And you mentioned the word autism to a degree. They share that same, similar, not same, but similar sort of the still face, that it's not animated, and it's not
Hmm.
engaged, and it's not connected, and there is
Yes.
that disconnect. And so that's what they're trying to compensate for. I mean, a lot of people
Yeah.
have said that narcissism is like a compensatory maladaptive coping mechanism to deal with trauma and interrupted development. And
Yes.
this indicates that that's exactly right. Okay,
Yeah.
let's continue with the bigger picture. Why is it, what things are happening that causes this to be such a complex um, thing that most people don't understand?
Great. Yeah. So let's get into that, because this is incredibly complicated, because what happens when this stuff starts so early in life, it affects many different things. And one thing that it affects, we could say, is the development of one's sense of self, right? So what
Yes,
actually ends up happening when that what I just described, that developing child, the infant looks away, they are not just looking away, they are withdrawing from reality. And what begins to happen is a structure begins to develop in their mind, right? So,
yes.
in other words, part of their personality is actually developing at this early age. And this is what we call traumatic loss. So, this, if it's not repaired, by the way, so by the way, some of these breaks in empathy or affect attunement, this is inevitable. It's going to happen in every child parent relationship. But what I'm talking about is when it happens too early or too often, or it's too intense and the repair is not done. In other words, you don't have a caregiver who can then go back and repair that separation that just happened. So, this is what's called a traumatic loss. And this is critical because later, when you and I keep talking, we
Mm-hmm.
want to get into what's necessary to heal from this sort of thing. And we're
Yes.
already mentioning so many different dynamics that go on. That's what makes this so complicated. Immediate gratification, we need to work on that. The fantasy is an illusion. We need to work on that. Now I'm talking, this is number 3, about a structure that develops in the mind to deny the traumatic loss. So, one wonderful way to deny traumatic loss is to make believe there is no loss, there is no separation, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's where the shared fantasy fits in perfectly. And that's where the merger of, like I said, the omnipotent, the grandiose self with the omnipotent other, because when there's a merger and that level of intensity of togetherness, it's like a patch. In other words, it's meant to patch over a gap that exists in the personality that cannot accept loss. So, just a fancy name for this, if I put a label on it, this is, again, in my field, what we call pathological mourning. So, it's not a mourning process where you're slowly accepting a painful reality, but is instead of turning away from a loss. And we see this, by the way, something that may resonate with your listeners, most everybody, is in somebody who knows or heard a story or actually has been scammed, right? Like scammed out of money, or they were a victim of a scam. The thing about the scammers are they are deceptive, kind of like a narcissistic partner to some extent, right?
Right.
Scammers are deceptive and they use tactics to do what? Lure you in. And some of the tactics they use are fake promises, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this appeals to some, not everybody gets scammed, by the way, and not everybody gets caught up in narcissistic relationships. So we need to figure out what differentiates them. And I think it's this traumatic loss that I'm describing, or this pathological mourning. But they use fake promises to deceive them, right? But the magic here is not that they're so crafty, in creating a scam, but it's the internal propaganda that goes on. That's the most important piece that I want to emphasize. And
I
that's why it works with some people, but not others. Wait, Jen, I'm going to pause for a moment because I saw you shaking your head and I wanted to
That
just see
was,
if you wanted to jump in.
I've never heard anyone say internal propaganda, and I'm loving this.
Oh,
The
okay.
light came on, and I thought, wow, that's exactly what it is. The only
Yeah.
thing I could to clarify, that means a lot of times we talk about how they gaslight their partners and the people, their children or whoever it is, right? But the truth is they gaslight themselves, and
Yes,
they believe their own fiction.
that's right.
And
So it's not
and
gaslighting then, actually. It's
well,
really not gaslighting.
because they do believe it, it's real to them. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, they're not trying to convince themselves of something that, crazy, because they don't see that it's crazy. They think that it's entirely, um, if you don't understand it, or if you don't see that, then there's something wrong with you, because this is reality. And so
Yes.
that's why they're so convincing when they're doing that future faking, the false
Yeah.
promising, and all of that kind of thing,
Yeah.
because they're
That's all of it. That's right.
they're
That's
buying it.
all the internal propaganda that you're describing right now that goes
Exactly.
on in their
I've
mind.
never heard internal propaganda before. I'm gonna
It's a very seductive narrative for both the
share.
person who has these narcissistic characteristics and the person who is in this relationship. Remember, because we're talking about why it's so hard to extract oneself. And
Mhm,
that's why a scam works so nicely. It takes two people to really pull off the scam. So one has the belief and the inner voice already that what? That this is the promise of salvation, transformation, ultimate fulfillment, right? I mean, I could keep going. But you get it, it becomes like a delusional state. And that's why even when people are being scammed, if they ever tell like loved ones like what they're participating in, the loved one gets it immediately. This is like you telling your friend about your relationship. And they're like, oh my God, you're being scammed. You have to stop. And they don't stop. Some people give away their life savings in these scams, right? But that's because it becomes a delusion, right? And if you
mm.
think that I'm exaggerating when I say delusion, if you've ever heard somebody, and I'm sure you have, Jen, and you have your own stories, but when you're in this kind of relationship, you could say in the same breath, right, that you've been treated very poorly in this way or that way. And at the same time, you could say, but maybe, and this is where it goes to the hope, right? Things are going to change, or if I don't do this again, or he's going to stop, he promised to stop drinking. I'm just making things up. But that's the magic that makes it work. These two sort of things coming together, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that, just disclaimer here, we are not victim blaming. I have heard that
Hmm.
from people, as a response to things that I have said similar to what you're saying, is that it
Yes.
takes two, that we participated in this mutually psychotic, um, pairing, and it's not that they did all this stuff to us. I think it's very dangerous to, adopt a victimhood stance. That
Yes.
is helplessness. That is, a lot of very negative things that you don't want, and it can keep you frozen and paralyzed, without
Hmm.
recovery, endlessly, forever. You're never going to be okay if your identity is that of a victim. But, in a sense, were a co-conspirator. You were a volunteer. You were vulnerable, and you just fell into it like the person who gets scammed. Some people wouldn't. They would recognize the red flags. Like, I'm
Yes.
not going to give my information away on the phone. They know, and
Yeah.
they hang up. Whereas others, it's not their fault. No one's blaming them. This isn't blame shifting, and it's not, we're victimized, saying that, that, that you weren't victimized, because you were victimized, yes, but you participated in that by being, um, eager to accept the whatever
Yeah.
was being put out there.
Yeah,
And
and it
I think that,
becomes
yeah.
yeah, and it becomes understandable, like, once you get close to the people also who are in these situations, right, like what you're calling the victim, I
Hmm.
don't even think, like, when you just said we have to be careful not to victimize, like, I don't wasn't even thinking that because my whole goal is just understanding how these two things, sort of co-occur. And even the person who gets swept up in this kind of relationship, it's not to say um that they've done something, right? Like that's wrong or like that's bad or there's something wrong with them, right?
No,
But what
it's
we
not
could
their
say is
fault.
maybe, yeah, that's right. Just like they could be going through a tough period in their life, for example. Maybe they just came out of a very difficult breakup, or maybe they just lost somebody very close to them. And they're in this very vulnerable place in life, right? And then they meet somebody like this, like the scammer, just to go back to that
Mhm.
analogy, right? Who
Absolutely.
offers this salvation, these promises, and it comes at a moment where they feel like very unrecognized, right? Or
Mhm.
disregarded or discarded, I should say, for whatever reason. So yeah, but I'm glad you clarified that. The goal is never to blame, it's to get as close as possible
Right.
to everybody's subjective experience of the situation. Because if you don't do that, what I see so often, and I listen to a lot of content on social media, is what happens, and again, this is just what I've recognized, or maybe these are the people with the loudest voices. If you can't come to understand what went wrong in a relationship, oftentimes these people, they do end up leaving, but they end up either going back in, and I've done episodes on this on my own podcast channel to demonstrate how this happens, and listening to these stories, they
Yes.
go back to that relationship, or coincidentally they happen to find themselves in another relationship where they feel again like they have been victimized or treated poorly, or they're again with what they call another narcissistically preoccupied person. And at some point you have to say, that's very curious. I wonder how something like this happens. And maybe then we could begin to do the deeper work to see, is there some pattern? Is there something that they're looking for that they're not finding within themselves for whatever reason? Yeah.
I will insert a bit of
Hmm.
anecdotal evidence, if you don't mind, really
Yes. Oh,
briefly.
okay.
I,
Okay.
um, I repeated the same dynamic with choosing people who were
Mm.
disordered 3 times in
Oh,
my life.
yes. Yes.
And in
Yes.
fact, I've only had 3 significant relationships, and all 3 were disordered because I discovered after years of therapy that I was trying to recreate a similar dynamic as that with my mother, who was a dead mother, who was inaccessible. She had mental health issues. She was unavailable to me. And so I chose these men so that I could repeat that dynamic and be victorious this time. And then, ta da, everything will be great.
Wait,
And
Jim, let me ask you that. Wait, hold on. Let me ask you that, because in my mind, what I just heard, and thank you for sharing this story, it really brings this home. Again, it's like the still face experiment that I mentioned. Like, this is proof, right? That we're
yes,
not just talking theoretically about stuff. But
no,
what
this
I
is real.
wanted to clarify is you said something like what you discovered, you were repeating a certain relationship from earlier
Yeah,
in life with your mother, right?
yes,
But
yes.
what I would imagine is, I don't think, and I'm just imagining, but you please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think you were simply repeating it. I think what happens is when you get with somebody like that, who's like what you said, disordered, there's an immense level of hope that this time it's going to be right. Like, in other words, you're not trying to repeat a situation where you're not seen or you're not recognized again. You're
Oh,
trying.
no, no, no.
Oh, okay, good. Yes,
I
yes.
wasn't repeating the whole thing. I was
Yeah.
repeating the dynamic,
Yes,
the
I see.
interpersonal pattern
Yes.
felt familiar.
Right,
It
you're repeating the whole thing, meaning eventually you end up feeling not seen again.
and I think that there's an element of parentification. I know that, he was my father, he was my mother, he was my child, he had all of these different roles, and we parented one another.
Yes.
Absolutely. So at the end, you're not just losing your spouse, you're losing a parent and a child and like all of these other roles that you're thinking, why would that person be that to you? But they are.
Mhm. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yep, that makes sense. So, just to sort of take a step back and then we could go forward if you like. So, you just reminded me when you said that. So, in repeating it, the main point of repeating it is what I mentioned earlier, sort of the underlying theory to this whole thing about the shared fantasy, this merger, the symbiosis, the symbiotic relationship is what I call pathological mourning. And just to go over that one more time, this is kind of like a denied loss. In other words, Every time that you get with somebody, there's that hope that you're finally going to be seen. So the loss remains disavowed, in other words. You
Yes.
never have to deal with it. So the allure of the shared fantasy or addictive behaviors, because, you know, nothing like there are very few things that could get you out of really difficult pain quickly. And one of them is fantasy. Another one is drugs, right? Like drugs
Yes.
give you a very quick boost. So drugs are wonderful as well, but there's the overlap right there. To again, the sort of over the umbrella question is, why is it so hard to get out of these relationships? Because yes, they become quite addictive, right? Kind of like a drug, because they do give you that boost, but you need the boost for many different reasons. There are different theories on it, but one theory is you need the boost to disavow a loss. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, you enter into fantasy, so this way you never have to be in reality. And let me not say ever, because of course you're straddling both. And I wanted to make that part very clear, because when it comes to healing, we need to recognize that there are moments, even for the narcissist, even though I know this could be debated, but even the narcissist has moments. The narcissist who's all caught up in the grandiose sense of self, even they have genuine moments, and they straddle mostly fantasy, but they put their foot in reality. And this is where, in terms of the work that I do with these individuals, because I mean, you in your intro said I'm in private practice. I'm with these people all day. You know, this is my full time job. And it becomes very clear to me that there are always moments where they have a foot or a toe, maybe. Let's say a toe initially early in the treatment, but then hopefully slowly, and this is part of the treatment process, is you help them get more grounded in a painful reality. But that's part of dealing then with loss and uncertainty. And that's where it gets really hard. You know, that's the real work of recovery, is trying to pivot them. And there's always the pull, the allure of going back to the fantasy. And they do, by the way. You know, even within a session, you could see it oscillate so quickly. But that becomes what we call grist for the analytic mill. In other words, it becomes part of the process in terms of what just happened at this moment. You and I were just talking about whatever it was, right? That something grounding them in reality, like how painful it's been without their significant other, right? And now you're telling me about how you picked up some girl the other night at a bar, some rando. I don't know, I'm just making this up.
Mm-hmm.
But this is part of the work that becomes so important with these individuals. And we can begin to show them slowly over time that they put a patch over. That's the patch again. That's the pathological mourning over feelings of loss, helplessness, inadequacy, anything that's going to generate very painful feelings. So let me breathe for a moment and see if any of that resonated.
Um, I have not thought about success rates so much
Mhm.
after a lot of the research I've done. It seems that there that most people will say that the outcomes are typically not good, and of all the mental health um, diagnoses that a person could get, bipolar, borderline, um, schizophrenic, whatever, that the outcome, a lot of times they're going to have positive outcomes with a combination of maybe medication and talk therapy and somatic therapy and little EMDR and trigger point therapy or bilateral stimulation. Just there's stuff available and accessible that has positive outcomes for almost all the different mental health um, uh, diagnoses, except narcissism and psychopathy, and maybe antisocial, those three, mostly narcissism and psychopathy. And the reason is that they will uh, not be dropping the mask truly, when they come to therapy, and they uh, kind of manipulate, use those Machiavellian little tactics that they have for whatever outcome they're trying to achieve. Maybe their spouse made them come to therapy, or maybe they were court ordered, but that the end result is much more difficult to reach them and to really affect lasting change, because they don't want to change. They have so much grandiosity, and they're delusional. It is a delusional disorder to the point where they can't see the truth of what you're telling them, that it is this grief, this extended grief, that they haven't processed, and that the answer for both the person in recovery, so that they don't repeat a similar relationship with another narcissist, and for the narcissist himself, is to go through their own personal grief and learn to process it and make peace with it and acknowledge it and feel it emotionally and in their body, and experience it and sit with it. And and they usually are not able or willing, or both, to do that. And so it's the toughest diagnosis to really give impactful um, treatment for.
So, would you like me to respond to that, or? Okay. So,
Yeah.
I agree with most of what you said, right? The part that I definitely agree with is this, by like, no doubt, these are some of the most challenging individuals in my practice. No doubt. Even more challenging, I work with a lot of borderline patients as well. They're very, they're challenging in their own way. But because of what you mentioned, the grandiose structure that holds them together, the false self, all of this stuff makes it almost impenetrable to
Yeah.
reach them. But the research actually, Jen, does show, there is research out there. It's psychodynamic research, it's based on a psychoanalytic model, which is what I practice, that these people do change. When you say outcome and do they change, you have to look at the measures, because different research studies use
Mm-hmm.
different outcome measures, but
Mm,
they do show significant amount of change in these patients. And the key is, well, and this part, I think it makes it a little more understandable, but you could tell me, they need to be committed to the work, and the work needs to happen frequently. So some of the research that demonstrates efficacy, they go twice a week. The patients that I typically work with, I mean, hold on to your chair, but they come to see me anywhere between 1 to 4 times a week. So
wow.
these are people who are very serious about changing. So you may be talking about a whole different cohort of people, maybe like you said, mandated, or their wife tells them to come. But anyway, I digress. But the research does demonstrate that these patients absolutely are treatable, and they do function in a way that it makes it hard to penetrate. And that's why it takes time. It's not a quick fix. This is not cognitive behavior therapy, where you go in for, maybe 3 months of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
No, that doesn't work. This is, longer term treatment. We're talking at least 1 to 2 years before you start to see pretty significant shifts. Increased reflective capacity, increases in empathy, increase in self-other differentiation, which is a big part we haven't even discussed yet. We need to talk about that, because remember, they merge. That's the whole shared fantasy, is there's no self-other differentiation. It gets wiped, not completely, but anyway. And what I found is, in my own practice, is if you can engage their curiosity, these are people then who do tend to stay. But you have to go very slowly. You have to ask inquisitive questions. You cannot you cannot you can't use interventions that link stuff back to the past. Like, you and I are talking about the past, which is good to understand from a theoretical perspective. But I don't use any of this stuff, not in the first year of treatment, because it doesn't make sense to them. They think in such a concrete way, which is, again, a whole nother thing, because we need to
Right.
talk about, because they don't have a capacity for symbolization. They tend to enact things. Anyway, I could keep going, but in short, what I'm saying is, yes, you are right. they are the most challenging, but with the right level of motivation and interest in change, sometimes when things are falling apart in their life, or sometimes when you can engage their curiosity, yes, the research shows this, and this has been my own experience as well in my practice. You do tend to see change over time, but it's slow, no doubt.
Hmm.
So, can I do a shameless plug for the next episode that you and I are going to be recording? Because we're going to get into treatment and all this stuff in a part two, and I want to make sure your listeners are aware of that.
Yes. There is going to be a part two. And Dr. Mazzella will be hosting me.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, you got to look for that. We'll try to connect the links in both of these, so you'll have
Yes,
a link to the other one in each of them, so you can hear
great.
part one and part two. So there's a few things that we have not touched upon that I would like to get to before we go.
Hmm.
Um, the way that the target in the relationship of the supply, I'm not going to call them victim or survivor or any of that. The person in the
Hmm.
relationship with them, the way that they are groomed, the way that they are trauma bonded, kind of what that is. Can we talk about intermittent reinforcement and like sort of the tactics that are at play in these relationships that that transport you to another place where it's just so much harder to come back from?
Yeah, the intimate reinforcement, again, I'm giving it to you from my own biased perspective as a psychodynamic thinker. But
Mm-hmm.
the intimate reinforcement in my mind is completely understandable. It's not a tactic. I wouldn't call it a tactic because with these, again, something you and I have not yet discussed is that these people who have narcissistic characteristics, lack what's called object constancy. It's just
Yes.
a fancy word to say, like, there's usually no consistency in the way they feel about a relationship. And this is part, and I'm sure you know about this, Jen, this is all part of the what underlays like splitting. So one moment you could be the most wonderful, loving person who's taking such good care of them. And then the next moment, you don't care about them. You always neglect them. You've never cared about them, right? So the intimate and reinforcement, I think what you're getting at is those moments where they really see and they appreciate you. And that feels so wonderful. And then suddenly that changes. And I think that's what you mean by intimate and reinforcement. Is that correct?
No, I'm thinking of things like breadcrumbing and future faking, and they make things so perfect, especially the covert narcissist, covert,
Hmm.
vulnerable, shy narcissist who never raises their voice and who is always very kind and soft spoken usually, and that kind of presents themselves that way. Then they seem like they are your dream come true. In many
Mm.
ways they are, because they mirror and parrot and reflect you. When you're looking at them, you're seeing yourself, because they have very little interior identity or self, to the point where they they are absorbing yours. So when you meet these people, they like what you like. That's their favorite food, that's their favorite music. Of course, this is what they want to do for their job, for their travel, for their whatever, they just absorb that and adapt like shape-shifting chameleons to reflect their partner. And so they appear to be just your soulmate and your dream come true, because they're reflecting you. And so you have that, but then at the same time, then you're seeing this impulsivity, this recklessness, this betrayal. They cheat, they lie, they do irrational things, sometimes criminal things, things that are just way, you know, violating every boundary in a relationship or all of your personal boundaries. They just do
Yeah,
atrocious things.
yeah,
But then and then the person just tries to look away, and not, they rationalize them. Well, they had been drinking. Oh, well, they were going through a stressful time. And oh, you justify their behavior I know when I was in that, I did. I
Yes.
defended, what he
Yes.
did because I didn't want to acknowledge the severity of it, what that indicated, how absolutely how he had violated my family members and so much
Well,
more.
is that not
I
part
I just
is that not part of what you and I spoke about a little bit earlier? Isn't
yeah.
that part of the shared fantasy that you're
So
not.
it is part of the shared fantasy.
Yeah.
The intermittent reinforcement is how they keep you hooked so that you just only see through the rose-colored glasses the good part, and when the bad parts pop up, you look away. And
Yeah.
they lure you in with the good stuff
Yeah.
and
So
keep you hooked with those
I
dopamine hits
okay,
that
I understand. I think this is probably one of my limitations, right, in working with these individuals day in and day out, is
Mhm,
I don't see it the way you're describing it. And I may have my own rose colored glasses on, or maybe it's because I get close to these people and I really get to understand and know them. And I work with couples too. So we really go over these things and the nuances of what happens. Like even the future faking thing, I don't even that doesn't even cross my mind. I wouldn't conceptualize it that way because they're not faking. Like when they're in it, and I think we went over this a little bit earlier, but when
right.
they're in it with you, it's not like they're faking, that they really believe this
Yeah, you're
at the
both
time.
believing. Mhm,
Yeah, so I and so the breadcrumbing or the future faking, these terms that you use, I see it as and about behaving one way with you and then a very different way. Again, I see that differently too because the underlying structure of the personality for the narcissist is what? It's the fragmented sense of self. They're
yes.
fragmented. And that's again part of the healing process that we need to talk about in part two. But when there's a fragmented sense of self, of course they're putting on their best face to you. That's
Mhm,
completely understandable because that's the false self, right? Because what are they looking to get? They're not in a relationship with you. Remember, we said that it's a fantasy relationship from their perspective as well. And all they're looking to get from you, you're like the mode of narcissistic repair. In other words, they've
mhm,
been so wounded, they need one thing from you. And whatever that's they need, we call it supplies. We have different names for it. So of course they're going to behave in a way that's fake with you, and then another side, the fragment, the other side of the split comes out when they're not looking to directly get those supplies from you. Why? Because now they're getting them somewhere else. You mentioned, I think, drinking or pornography or whatever else they're doing. It's still the same underlying mechanism. They still need the supplies, right? So when
mhm.
they go do that other thing, they'll just get it that way. Anyway, I'm sort of going off a little bit, but the short answer is, in my biased opinion, and I'm admitting it's probably biased. I don't use those concepts. I don't see them as future faking. I see them as really just trying to survive and get what they need from you. And they're going to do whatever's necessary. And if that means putting on a mask and acting like in a way that's going to please you to keep you happy and attached to them so that there's no separation and you're in that fused relationship, blissful. Like life is blissful and there's no loss. And this is the whole underlying theory. One theory that's the whole aim, is to avoid any sort of loss or painful feelings.
Exactly. And I just want to name, as far as future faking, I am never implying that they know they're future faking or
Hmm.
that any calculated, um, deliberate thing, but
Okay.
it
Okay.
isn't real because you're not real.
That's right.
They snapshot you and they internalize you and you're an object like a toaster or a cell phone. And when you're not glittery and sparkly in the newest model, they discard you and replace you with a newer model because you're just an object. And there may be little flickers of that authentic self that are in there that might not the one that comes out and allows them to act out and do cheating and pornography or those kinds of things, but the part where you really see that little child, that injured, traumatized, grieving child. for
Mhm.
just a flash of a moment,
Yes,
but
yes.
they keep him behind, like,
Yeah,
locked
and
up.
that's why it takes a really savvy person. This is why if they do get therapy, this is the other piece I didn't mention earlier, which is part of the prognosis. Remember you were asking, like, do they
Yes.
change or they don't change? Oftentimes they don't go to people who are very experienced or specifically experienced and have, training and the experience to work with personality disorders. And I get a lot of these patients now because they're doing their homework, they listen to my podcast, and then they recognize they've been through many therapists who didn't have the capacity to really help them. But anyway, that's a whole nother story.
Well,
I
I
think
just
we,
want to say
yeah.
you are a blessing to people because of your vast knowledge and the depth of your understanding of this topic. And if you can serve anyone, but the narcissist or their person that they were with that is having a hard time moving on, it doesn't matter. We're here to serve everyone.
Hmm.
Um, and right now, I think, when people want to escape, they look at the world around us, and reality is pretty gritty and scary and not great right now. And escaping anyway, shopping, gambling, a relationship that's unhealthy, um, just any escape, drinking, drugging is
Hmm.
is better than having to stay grounded and rooted in reality and face those harsh things that are
Yes.
on
Yep.
point right now. Who would
Yep.
choose that? I'm
Yep.
going to take the fantasy hands down because it's so much more fun and easier and happier and
Right,
better in
right.
so many
People,
ways.
you're right. Listen, Jen, again, I am with you 95%, but I just want to respond. The people who would choose the more painful reality would choose it because they come to recognize over time that the other stuff feels good in the moment. But then overall, they don't feel good about themselves and nothing is changing. And eventually, and again, this is what I help these individuals with, by the way, the same exact thing. Eventually, they get to the point where we start to question, if this isn't working, how come I keep trying the same thing, whether it's gambling, the cell phone, technical relation, whatever it is, right? So, and so, yes, the fantasy world, like everything you described, is amazingly appealing. But the reason that not everybody chooses that is because slowly they come to recognize that they're fixated, they're stuck, they're not developing, and they know that deep inside themselves. They do
Yes,
know it.
I want to put one more argument out there. For me,
Mhm.
having chosen fantasy over reality repeatedly, I now stand in reality and understand why I
Mhm.
have to if I want to be a real person. And I think what
Yes.
motivates me is I want to be a model to show my children who
Mhm.
are adults now that you can overcome these toxic relationships that you're compelled to do because of your early scripting and programming that went awry. That at some point you have to turn and face the beast. At some time you have to wrestle your demons and face reality and live in it and stay in it to be accessible to those you love. And that is
Mhm.
my motivation to finally say, I'm an old woman now. I don't have time to do that again. And I owe it to my family to live in reality and be there, um, connecting with them, putting, even though it's, difficult. Yeah, it's difficult. I picked the worst time I can think of in my lifetime to decide to be in reality. But
Yeah.
but that's where I live now
Yeah.
because of what you said. And I
Yeah.
don't know if everybody arrives at that point, and I'm certainly not judging those who are repeatedly doing what I did for many, many years, because I understand how easy it is to just fall into the rabbit hole
Mhm.
and
Yes.
to stay there. And it's just so um it just happens before you know it, and it just takes such effort and hard work to choose reality instead, and an
Mhm.
awareness that you need to and what it looks like.
Mhm.
That's where
Yes.
you come into play. You have to help people
Well, thank you
be
for that.
able
Thank you.
to do that, and that's just a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
We've got about 5 or 10 more minutes. What things do you think we need to know as we think about this topic of why people have such difficulty with recovering and from getting past this?
I think, to be honest with you, this is going to sound a little strange given how long you and I have been talking, but I think we've done a really amazing job today of beginning to describe what keeps them in the relationship. I think we need this is going to be part two in my mind, Jen, if you feel up to it. The whole second piece of this is yes, you and I are talking about being in reality right now, but there are so many more nuances. And that's a whole nother discussion, which is if you manage to get out of this kind of relationship and you feel like you either feel stuck in life or you're returning to similar relationships, you and
Hmm.
I need to talk about what's necessary to move forward and live a healthier, more integrated life. But I think that's part two because if you open that door now, we're going to be here for another 45 minutes.
All right. Okay. Um, I just want to stress again, especially if this podcast is shared with people who have not been in these relationships, nor have they known anyone who had this disorder. I'm hoping that it is informative and that it kind of pulls back the veil to help you understand that there are some very complex things at play, both with the person with narcissistic personality disorder and with the person that chooses to be in a relationship with them. And sometimes
Yes.
it's not a choice. I also want to name that. If your parent is the narcissist or your child, sometimes it's not like a partnership, like spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend kind of thing. I also want to name that in the past, it seemed that there were more males who had narcissistic personality disorder and that kind of thing than females. And now that we're in 2025, it has leveled out more according to different studies that have been done.
That's so, yeah. Jen,
And
that's so
it's,
interesting. I'll just say one thing there quickly. As you were just talking about how it's sometimes two people in a relationship, I was going in my mind, I was free associating, right? A lot
yes.
of the emails that I get from the listeners of my podcast, they're like, Dr. Mazzella, I'm very confused. I'm listening to your podcast and I can't figure out, is it my narcissistic husband or am I narcissist? Am I a narcissist? And these are women who are reaching out to me. And you just mentioned this, the proportion is changing, right? So I
Yeah.
think you're right. Many more women maybe are beginning to recognize because of the education and the information you're getting out there, we're getting out there, that it's not as easy as just saying, my husband is a narcissist. It gets a little more complicated and they begin to question that. Hmm.
Well, not to say that maybe they are, but I would
Yeah,
tend to say in that case, more than likely, when you're with them, you do question that
yeah,
because it totally destroys your identity and your self esteem and all of that. And there's so much blame shifting in the relationship where they are never accountable for anything. They cannot be accountable for their actions. It's always their partner's fault,
yeah,
110% of the time. So
yes,
after being subjected that to that for a period of time, you begin to wonder what's wrong with me
yeah,
when there is
yeah,
nothing wrong with you. And so that would be my first response, that it's not that it's possible that they could be narcissists. If their partner has been diagnosed, if it's just with a high degree of certainty that they suffer from this disorder, then the odds of you also having it are very slim. I think it's much more likely that you're doing that self-blaming, could I be one? That is a very natural, normal question of every partner, of every child of a narcissist. And one last thing that probably is not a good thing, but it needs to be said: the longer you're with them, the more mentally, physically, spiritually unhealthy it makes you. And studies have shown that people who spend their whole lives with a narcissistic partner have this hive mind, where it's a one mind symbiotic kind of, you lose yourself, you're consumed, you're you know, swallowed alive in a way, so that they become you, and you lose yourself. And you become sicker. You do develop some narcissistic tendencies that amplify and become larger than what they were when you got into this thing. So it's like a virus in a way, an infection that if you're with them for a very long period of time, they can co-opt your brain in a way that you do become where you have more of these traits. So it's a dangerous thing to stay, but I
Mhm.
understand how difficult it is to leave, and many of us couldn't do it, just couldn't. Wasn't really a choice for the reasons we will discuss in part two.
Mhm. Wonderful. And thanks for that clarification. I just want to reiterate that point. So even though I get those emails and they're like, is it my husband or am I a narcissist? Just in general, believe it or not, even though you and I are using a lot of this kind of language today, I rarely, with patients or even people in my life, use that word narcissist, like you're a narcissist, or, if anything, we just look at what's the subjective experience. We get as close as possible to what's going on, what's paining you, what are you suffering with, and the labels become far less important. At least in my, sometimes I get calls for a consultation if I could diagnose them. Can you diagnose me? And I tend to shy away from that, believe it or not, because in my
Oh,
field in psychoanalysis, we're not so interested in labels and diagnosis. We're interested in healing people. So, but thanks for clarifying that, Jen, and
I
giving me, yeah.
want to add to that.
Hmm.
My take on it is that if you drink a poison, you need to know what kind it is so you know how
Mm,
to treat it. And I say that because um, just to say that you're in a dysfunctional relationship could be a billion different things. And if there's a way to get a diagnosis, which is I know is really hard for that person to know for sure that you're dealing, because I'm not comfortable with the self-diagnosing your partner. Like, I think they're a
hmm.
narcissist because they ticked these boxes.
Yes.
I don't think we should be doing that to our partners. You can suspect that they might be. I think it's a growing phenomena. I think that there's more and more. We live in a society that's more narcissistic, and in a world that definitely is led by people with this disorder. And so, of course, you might be tempted to think that your partner is one, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're just a
Mm.
jerk. Maybe it's just a generic dysfunctional toxic relationship
That's a
because
very good point. No, that's a
they're
really
not a
good
nice
point.
person. But
Yeah.
if you know it's narcissism, then you know that you can expect this very um uh tangible set of things, and just knowing what you're dealing with and having names for it and understanding the whole way it works. For me, I spent years in therapy after the other, failed two relationships of my life, and I had children with these people, and so I was highly motivated to get myself in a better place. But it wasn't until this last one, and this was the only person I have ever been with that had narcissistic personality disorder, until I knew and understood all of the parts of that, specifically that. Because we had been in therapy and he had been diagnosed 4 years before the end of our relationship, and I was minimizing it, discounting it, saying, I got this, I can heal him, whatever's wrong with him, we'll be fine. Because we were, had been together already for 12, 13 years at that point. And I was wrong. And I wish I had understood specifically narcissistic personality
Mm,
disorder on that end of the spectrum, because for me, that was the thing that made all the difference in the world.
mm,
And that's why I have written over 300 articles and done all these podcasts, is to educate those who have been in these relationships to understand all of the underpinnings, all the ins and outs, and take a deep dive to unpack all of it Because through understanding how they got that way, what was this? What was that called? What's this other thing? Why am I feeling it in my body? Why do I have PTSD? Why do I have anxiety? Why do I have these things? I know why now. I understand
Hmm.
it by studying very deeply the whole narcissistic cycle of abuse and what it does to people. And I never understood it before. And that's what saved me.
Hmm.
So for some people, I think they need to know that what they're dealing with.
Okay. On that note, Jen, well, it's been
Uh,
a real pleasure. I want to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to share some maybe what are unique thoughts, but different thoughts, let's say, on this really, like I said at the beginning, complicated topic. So thank you
well,
again for giving me this time.
absolutely. I want to thank you for sharing. You have a very deep and vast knowledge of this
Oh, thank you.
subject. And I think knowing all of these things empowers you in a way to help people that, and I just want to say, the majority of mental health professionals have no idea um, about specifically cluster B disorders. I know when I was taking classes in college and getting my, I have a master's in guidance and counseling. Um, it was a chapter, one
Hmm.
little chapter, and it glossed over, and we spent all of our time talking about other things in like abnormal psych and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
that I don't think most clergy, most school counselors, a lot of social workers that do mental health therapy counseling for people, people on all of those levels do not know what this is. They don't recognize the red flags. They don't know what is wrong with the person who comes to them with complex PTSD and symptoms and who's having adrenal failure and a complete like existential crisis. They don't get it because they haven't been trained and they don't know what you know. You know because you're a doctor and they have talked about this with you. You have studied it
Well,
and
the
you
the
do understand.
reason I know, and I think this will be helpful for your listeners as well, or the reason I know a lot about this, or people who tend to know a little bit more, are those who go on beyond the graduate level of training that you were describing. Like you said, you could have a master's in social work. You can even have a psychology degree, by the way. It's really the postgraduate training. In your introduction, you mentioned that I'm on faculty, I'm very involved in that community. But that's where you really learn how to understand psychopathology and treat it. But not all people, because that takes more time and more training. If I told you how many more years psychoanalytic training is, again, you would fall off your chair, like I mentioned earlier.
Tell
But
us.
this is what people do who are really invested in understanding this at a really
Yeah.
deep level because it's so complicated.
It
Yeah,
is extensive and
yeah,
it's years and years. It's like a doctor that decides to be a surgeon. My first
exactly.
husband
Yes,
was a doctor and he tried the surgery residency program.
yes,
To begin with, he made it through the first 2 years. It's a 5-year pyramid. It's rigorous, it's intensive, it's brutal, it's competitive, it's
yep,
all these things. And so we're talking maybe 15, 20 years of your life have spent preparing to
exactly.
do what you're
Yes,
doing. So
yep. You
I
know
just
it. You know.
you
Hmm.
are a rare bird because the majority of people don't know what you know. And I find that disconcerting in a way for all the people needing help. They don't have access to you. We can't all come to you. I feel like there should be some required professional development or something to at least put this on their radar. Just give them a
Hmm.
little, maybe you could write a course that would sort of condense the main points and things to look for to help your clients and then put it out there for
It's a
people.
good idea,
Uh,
actually. Because I actually do that. That's the courses that I teach, but they're not available to the general public. I mean, these are for candidates, students who are going through the
but
postgraduate
they
training.
left that
Yeah.
postgraduate training is what I'm saying. And
Yes.
I
Yes.
think it should be required for all of them.
Yes.
That's me.
Yep.
Yep. Yep, I do. So
Well, thank you again, Jen. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you
So
so much for
I'll
being
see you
here.
for part two if you still feel up to it.
Absolutely. And you guys that are listening right now, don't miss it because you know this guy knows what he's telling you here. And it's so important. You don't want to get the wrong information and you don't want to run around thinking there's something wrong with you. You're experiencing something. And that person that, you know, that may have had this disorder, yeah, we need to understand that too. So please stay with us and follow Dr. Mazzella. How do we follow your work? Is there a way to do that?
Everything's on my website, so that's the easiest way. And I'll give you the link so you could put it in your show notes. But
Okay, so
basically, the podcast is there. Yep,
look
the
below
videos are there. Mhm.
podcast videos. What else?
Articles that I write, blogs, publications that I have. Everything is on the website.
So just look below, look right down under in the description, and click on that website for Dr. Mazzella and start studying, start following, start reading him. This guy knows his stuff, and you know we need to have more of that. Definitely, definitely. So thank you so
Yeah,
much for
great.
being here today.